Hello, my speech today is on the history of the band Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin is an English-based rock band that was formed in the late 1960s. Most of them, I believe, are from London, but they're definitely all from the UK. The band consists of the drummer John Bonham, the bassist/keyboardist John Paul Jones, the singer Robert Plant, and lead guitarist Jimmy Page. They were a band from 1968 to 1980 with 8 studio albums and 4 live albums and several tours in between those 12 years. I'm going to start with basically the history of before they got together, so before the band. The group was considered a super group, so it was just a bunch of people from other smaller bands that were lesser known coming together to make a bigger, better band, basically. Jimmy Page came from the Yardbirds, and he was basically the one that started Led Zeppelin. He was the one that had the in already with all of the bigger musicians at the time. They were originally going to call Led Zeppelin the New Yardbirds, but they obviously decided against it because the story behind their name is Jimmy Page was, since he was already in the Yardbirds and he was already relatively famous at that point, he knew The Who, the band The Who's drummer, and this is very quoted, said, and I quote, that their band would go down like a Led Zeppelin, and a Zeppelin being basically a hot air balloon, so falling to the ground. And they liked that, so they named it Led Zeppelin. In their early years, their first 4 albums, they did self-titled albums, so they did Led Zeppelin 1, Led Zeppelin 2, 3, and 4. They basically cemented them as bona fide rock stars. They sort of got hot-headed, but not really, I guess. It just is a matter of opinion. But they would refuse television appearances because they insisted that their fans or listeners heard their live sound instead of over a television set. They sold out shows, sold out albums. They were relatively successful, and very successful for the time that they were out. However, then comes the downfall. The downfall basically started with all of them getting into substance abuse of some kind. Most of them did different things. Some of them did it not really as much as others, but they were a select few who did abuse alcohol and heroin in particular. That all started with them, the more famous that they grew, along with several other bands, especially rock bands at the time. They just were partiers. That's just how it was back then. It was when, I guess, things were changing in America. But they all started partying a lot harder. They met up with other rock bands and music at the time, and they would all just throw giant parties, and this led to their eventual extreme substance abuse problems. But they also, because of their crazy parties that they started becoming known for, started doing some weird things. There's something called the shark incident, which I won't go it's not appropriate, so I'm not going to go into it, but they started becoming more known for these crazy things that they would do instead of for their music. Although the music was still very popular, their reputations were changing based on their public appearance. And then in the late 1970s is when it all sort of started falling apart. I think it was 76. Robert Plant got in a really bad car crash and was really injured. Also, his son, who was an infant, died of, I believe it said, a chest infection. And that obviously affected his mental state with substance abuse. It just made it worse. Jimmy Page, the lead guitar, started doing heroin, and that was his vice. John Paul Jones didn't really do much. He partied, but it wasn't a big problem. And John Bonham eventually became, by this point, he was a full-blown alcoholic. In 1980 is when it all came to a head, and Jimmy Page threw a huge party and everybody was there, but John Bonham, the one who was an alcoholic at this point, abused alcohol and ended up aspirating on his own vomit from being so drunk and died. So that was basically the end of Led Zeppelin as a band. They are incredible musicians with an incredible story, and they are still very well known today. This leads me to my visual aid. I do have a record, and it is a vinyl, but I bought this in the last 5 years, so they are still very well known today. Their legacy will probably go on as long as people talk about them. But that is the history of Led Zeppelin. Thank you, and I hope you learned something.